Oh, sure. We're missing one. Hey, Steve. Can you find quick? So just a quick note, we have some technical difficulties for projection, that is visual projection, so you might have to forego that, but we'll do our best. The second thing is that we're suddenly missing one of our speakers, but as soon as he's back, we'll get underway. And of course, you're all invited to come down closer, so feel free to take front seats if you'd like. we're going to take a picture.
If you don't mind, I'm going to grab a. I won't get photo.
Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll get underway. Clearly, some people have summer vacations that they're enjoying, so hopefully you all have yours already. We're planning to do one soon. Expect that as we continue this series, those who are vacationing will join us. But we're undaunted. Thank you. This is the second of our speaker series. The first one was on health equity about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, and we are going to continue the series tonight with the topic of restorative justice. Following this one, in about a month or so from now, we'll be talking about the hope in substance use services for those who have addiction issues. After that, with some scheduling, unhoused and housing the unhoused, food insecurity, and on from there. These speaker series events are designed to bring into conversation in Lawrence and surrounding communities the issues that we all know are here. We are just concluding our community health needs assessment, which is a requirement for Lawrence General Hospital to do every 3 years. And we are delighted to partner with them because what they need to know, we need to know too at the Greater Lawrence Family Health Center. But I'll give you a sneak peek, even though it's coming out in about a week. The reality is that the same things are on this community health needs assessment as have been there for the last one, and the one before that, and the one before that. And guess what? The one before that. The issues are access to healthcare, their food insecurity, their substance use disorder treatment, their being unhoused. You know, we know what these problems are. And then people finally begin to list, oh yeah, diabetes, hypertension, the medical things, right? So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to sort of figure out that maybe if you took care of some of the things upstream, people wouldn't be getting sick enough to need Greater Lawrence Family Health Center services and LGH services. We can retask to the ones who are really, really seriously sick or into prevention services. But clearly, you know, there are lots of things that are structured in our society that don't make it easy for people to maintain their health. And we're going to get into a conversation with our two guest speakers here. To my immediate left is Mr. Quin Gonell, who is head of Restorative Justice here at Lawrence High School, soon to be Dr. Quin Gonell. He's finishing his PhD. And the topic of his PhD is restorative justice. So we're honored to have a soon-to-be newly minted expert in the field here speaking with us. And then to his left is Mr. Jadi Taveras, who is head of school at Esperanza Academy. And Yari brings with him the experience of implementing restorative justice in a girls' 5th through 8th grade school over the last 4 years. And so we're going to be hearing lots about what that is like from Jadi. So I've been using this word restorative justice, and I want to say, you know, like anybody, I can Google, I can try to go figure out what does that mean and where does it come from. It does have a history. And the history is one which invites us to imagine differently, a school experience differently than the ones that we, all of us, have. Okay? I stand before you what I might term as a lucky man. I was lucky because when I was a boy of
5, 6, 7 and starting school, I was a bit of a knucklehead. Okay, I did not get school. School did not compute. I had older sisters and they told me about school and it seemed kind of scary, right? And then I got into school and frankly, I would rather daydream than listen to the teacher. It felt to me like a Charlie Brown episode, you know, where the teacher's going, wow, 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 wow. That's kind of what I heard, all right? I could get the math pretty quickly and I knew how to read, but it wasn't really clicking why this person was standing up in front of me. And as a result, guess what happened? You know what happened, right? I was called out for talking to my classmates, and I was called out for doodling. And before you knew it, I was being punished for these activities. Not a very good trajectory for a black or brown boy in the 1960s, okay? Today, we would call that trajectory, if it continued on, and I got more and more disenfranchised from the enterprise of being in a school and learning. We would call that being on the school to prison pipeline. And there's been plenty written about that as well, the new Jim Crow and other things, right? So why am I lucky? I'm lucky because my dad at the time was in law school and his father was a schoolmaster. And so education had been in my family. My mother went through school as to become an LPN. They were both on the Parent Teachers Association board. And so they all knew that there was another way to handle young guy. I actually had a nickname, I won't go there. But young guy getting in trouble and being in trouble in the school. And so when they found out that I was actually, it got to the point where I was being told, you remember the cloakroom, anybody? Yeah, I was being told, go stand in the cloakroom. Yep. And, first time it was 5 minutes, and then it was, 10 minutes, and then it was like, I think she forgot about me. But in some ways, to me, I'm a 6-year-old kid. I didn't still understand what this school thing was supposed to be about, right? And so for me, standing in a cloakroom was like, okay, I'll entertain myself. And then ended up that one day while I was entertaining myself, I noticed that there were some straight pins on the floor. I picked them up and I was playing with them. Ironically, my wife had the same experience. We won't go there right now. She did the exact same thing. Picked up a straight pin and didn't have any place interesting to put it, so I put it into the light switch. And there were sparks. Thank God I wasn't killed, but it blew out the entire electrical system of the school. Okay. And if I was on the school to prison pipeline before, I certainly was at that point. All right. So again, I'm a lucky man because I had parents who were engaged and understood things about the legal system, the school system, and education, were able to come in and intervene and, make adequate representation to those who were in charge of the school that this situation is already in hand. He's going to be punished. You don't need to do that to him, for him. Well, thank God. And then, of course, years later, I'm living in Cambridge, and my son is doing the equivalent of putting a pin in a light socket, which is that social media had started. He went on Facebook to rag on the assistant principal. And that created sparks of their own. And guess what? Now I'm in my father's role, going in and explaining that you don't need to do this to him. This situation is in hand. And by the way, he's already showing you what you don't get and understand about social media. So why don't you partner with him and have him come into the office an afternoon a week to teach you about social media. So we turned it around. So he's a lucky boy too. But luck shouldn't be the thing, right? It shouldn't be about luck. And it shouldn't be about what zip code you're in or whether your parents are in the PTA. right? It should be about creating systems that already understand that punishing kids, putting them in a cloakroom, not a good idea. Not a good idea. So, I know we've had some technical difficulties. I don't know if we've resolved them. I doubt it. So we'll have to be creative here. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to Jadi Taveras first to introduce himself and to give us some comments and introduction and remarks about restorative justice. And then he'll in turn turn it over to Quin Gonell. All right, so you can take it from there. Thank you, Jadi.
Thank you, Dr. Fish. Good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing? Good. All right. Well, that was a beautiful story. Thank you for painting that so clearly for folks to get a sense of, the need for restorative justice, but also kind of the lack of imagination that happens in education, almost the laziness of the educational system sometimes when we think about teaching, particularly Black and brown children, and kind of just quickly go to what's the quickest answer here? What's the quickest form of discipline without thinking, all right, what is this kid showing, or how can I unpack what's happening in this situation to better support this kid so that this child wants to be in school, so that this child loves school. And that's a lot of what restorative justice is about. And I have a PowerPoint that I put together that I have in front of me. I tend not to stick to slides. And so I'm gonna go in a lot of different directions here, but we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. And if there's anything that I say that kind of triggers a thought for you, please feel free to ask me any questions that you may have. I'll share a little bit about Esperanza first. Some folks are familiar with Esperanza, others are not. Esperanza Academy is an all-girls school in Lawrence, Mass. It's about 16 years old. It's a tuition-free independent school, so we're not public, we're not charter. Our operating budget is about $2.8 million, so this year we have to fundraise the $2.8 million from private donors and foundations. There are 3 criteria for students to come to Esperanza. They have to identify as a girl, they have to live in Lawrence, and their family has to qualify for free and reduced lunch. And then it's a lottery-based program. And so the school is 5th through 8th grade with a 12-year commitment. And that piece is really important. So we actually have an office that is responsible for placing the students in high school and college. And those placements are based on best fit. Because we're a lottery-based school, both academic and social emotional needs of our kids are going to vary greatly every single year. And so some of our students will stay locally. We have students at Notre Dame Cristo Rey, we have students at Abbott, and we have students at Brooks and Governors and Milton and all the New England boarding schools and some of the day schools as well. And that Office of Graduate Support sees them through our high school and college. Let me actually get started with just a quick synopsis of the mission of the school. And this is really important, this mission, because this is our new mission. And this mission was created after we became a restorative school. After, when I talk about the 5 pillars, after that was really cemented at the school. And the mission is, and I'll say it slowly so that you can hear, when you hear this mission and you think about Dr. Fisher's story, you can see what it is that we were trying to accomplish. Esperanza Academy is a tuition-free all-girls middle school built on justice and centered in joy. We celebrate, challenge, and inspire each student to embrace their brilliance. Our program empowers girls to redefine what is expected of them, to counter social limitations, and to take on challenges that will positively impact the trajectory of their lives in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and beyond. So the pedagogical kind of scaffolding of our program is based on 5 pillars. And the one that I'll spend the most time talking about is restorative justice, but I'll go through these quickly. So restorative justice for us is not just about repairing harm, it's about a relationship-centric ethos in the school. It's about trust and transparency. It's about adults being able to trust each other and being transparent with each other. It's about student to adult relationships, it's about parent to administrative relationship. It is about being a relationship-centric school where folks feel that they are seen, valued, and respected. And through restorative justice that we actually accomplish that. And when I get into the details of RJ work, you'll see how we do that. The second piece is that we are a music therapy school. And so that in itself is part of the restorative justice model, because we know that in communities of color, therapy is taboo. Talk therapy can be very taboo. But music has been central to the experience of Latinx folks forever. Music has been essential to the human experience forever. Mothers have been singing to their babies forever to calm them. Music is a central component of what it means to be human, to calm the nervous system. And so if we know that music can do that, what we have found is that music therapy is an incredibly valuable source to not only combat what's called ACE scores, early childhood adversity scores, but also to teach kids healthy coping mechanisms just for everyday stresses of life. So we actually this year have now an official partnership with Berkeley School of Music. They have a Center for Music Therapy, and Berkeley is using Esperanza as a model to show what the impact of music therapy could be in Black and Brown communities. Through the gas explosions of 2018 and through the pandemic, what we found is that students gravitated towards music therapy, and their parents gravitated towards it. And so that's restorative, because what we're saying is that, and I will repeat this point several times in the presentation, is that we are acknowledging the geopolitical context that creates some of the stressors and the behaviors that we see in our students, and developing a system to address that. We're not telling our students, here's a system that we think is best for you. We know that music is a form of healing. I know what song my mom played on Sundays when she was frustrated and she wanted us to get up. I know what song my family played when they were missing their life in the Dominican Republic and when they came together. When they were coping through their trauma together as immigrants. I know what music they listened to. We are using the language of the community we are serving to help them through the stresses of growing up Black and brown and poor in the United States of America. That's restorative. Not just about harm and repairing harm. It's about finding systems that counter the implications of growing up in a particular way, in a particular demographic, in a particular context. You know, the third piece, of course, of the school is academic excellence. Our school is 7:30 to 5, and our kids, like I said, a lot of successes in our students and where they go to high school and college and whatnot. We have a 100% high school graduation rate and a 77% college enrollment rate. But even our academic program has, our grading system is called Grading for Equity. With those who are in academia know that that's how folks are kind of trying to think about grading systems now, which is based on, it's moving away from the kind of hierarchical grading system that exists in traditional schools and trying to think about meeting students where they're at with their needs while still challenging them. I should say that our motto is high challenge, high support, high joy. And in our academic program, what we do is we reflect Lawrence as much as possible. And we reflect immigrant stories as much as possible. Because again, once students feel seen and respected and valued in the space that's their school, they're gonna want to learn explicitly and implicitly. The stress levels are gonna go down. They're gonna enjoy being in the classroom reading The House on Mango Street. When all of a sudden you read a character and it's just like your Tia. Now you really wanna get into the book. Now you say, maybe I wanna be a writer. The fourth piece is love of community. And this piece is really, just like in the academic program, but the love of community piece is really central because our girls are in middle school. They will hear so many narratives about what it means to be a Latinx girl, about what it means to be a daughter of an immigrant, of what it means to be first gen, of what it means to be from Lawrence. The world will tell them all kinds of things about that. There's no doubt. I'm from Lawrence. Boys and Girls Club kid here, went away to boarding school. It took me forever to get to the place of understanding the brilliance that exists in our city and in the immigrants that raised me. We want our kids to have a sense of self and a sense of place that is in armor from all the negative narratives that they will hear. That will then in turn turn to internalized narratives about themselves. If this is what the world says about immigrants, then this must be true for me. So our programming, how we hire at Esperanza, every person reports to a person of color. We are at a place now where there are adults in the community, at the school, that reflect the students in the community that we serve. And that is a new thing, and that is a hard thing to achieve in an educational setting these days. And then the graduate support program, which I talked about, the 12-year commitment. But for the sake of this presentation, and somebody's gonna have to stop me on time at some point here because I'm just gonna go, I'll leave that up to you, Dr. Fish. The restorative justice piece, so taking a closer look at what that means. Restorative justice is it's an ancient indigenous wisdom and practice around, repairing harm traditionally. And as I said, a lot of it is also about building community. And whether it's like for us, our students every morning get together in a circle. That's how they start their day. They're with their advisors and they're in a circle. And yes, you can have circle practice, for example, if there's a fight between students and you want to unpack that fight, you have a circle practice and everybody has equal playing field to talk about it. But you can also have a circle practice in the morning that says, like, what's your favorite thing abuela makes? See? And all of a sudden, every student is talking about their favorite thing they eat at home. And all of a sudden, every student is saying, oh, I love my abuela's bandules también. And all of a sudden, their stories feel safe by a simple prompt in a circle. All of a sudden, their identities feel safe. They feel like they can share these things, these quirks about their family. So every morning, their circle practice. When you think about things like apartheid in South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, that was a restorative process. It's not just about who is doing the harm. It's about how do the people feel who the harm is being done to? And what's the impact on the community and the nation? And in South Africa, that's what had to happen. People had to confront face to face the realities of their actions over hundreds of years. And that healing process is incredibly restorative. And that's what we're trying to do in schools and at Esperanza in particular. And, the piece about it being indigenous, we always say at Esperanza, it's like, we talk about restorative justice, and for some folks, it's like, it's this new thing that we're doing, and it's like kind of cutting edge, and it's innovative, but we don't talk about it as learning something new, we talk about it as remembering. The idea of gathering in circle is old. The idea of building community around trust and transparency, we've been doing that forever. We are trying to remember things that are viscerally in us, that are important, that are innate in us. We're trying to shackle ourselves from what everybody else told us what community means, what an organizational structure means, what working at a place means. We are trying to remember who we are as humans and how we connect and what's important to us. There is really no reason why you shouldn't, for the folks who are working at Esperanza, they should all feel seen. For the students, they should feel seen. Like, this is what we want. And so the restorative justice process does it with adults as well. Today we have our new faculty and staff orientation, and they were in circle practice to make sure that their stories are protected and safe as well. Typical justice asks, what law was broken, who broke it, and what punishment do they deserve? Restorative justice asks, who was harmed, what are their needs, and how can we repair the harm? We want to ask the question, why did the person who caused the harm cause the harm? We do not want to penalize students for circumstances that they have inherited. When you think about the geopolitical context that we live in, redlining, how ghettos were created in the United States, when you think about the implication of food deserts, when you think about all the consequences of growing up, and oftentimes systemically in places like Lawrence, there are behavioral consequences for their implications. And so when something happens with a child, whether it's the child that harm is done to or the child doing the harm, the question is, how did we get there? And restorative justice through circle practice tries to unpack that, but also through the relationship building part of it. If you know a child well, you're going to understand, I know that this is happening at home, and I know that this is the history. And therefore, this behavior that the child just had, we will be penalizing them for something that they inherited and not for who they are. So how do we address the root cause of that behavior and leave the kid in school and make sure that they're not losing academic time, as opposed to quickly assigning a punishment? And what Dr. Fish was talking about with the school to prison pipeline, that is what happens. There are kids that are coming to school already with flight and fight already activated. Stress levels are super high. If that is true, you can expect a certain behavior at school. And if the quick answer is detention, suspension, whatever it may be, that will be a trajectory for that child. Detention, suspension, that's in your transcripts, expulsion, that often leads to a school to prison pipelines. We're trying to disrupt that system at Esperanza. Racism in the American legal system becomes racism in the school system. You know, recently in Massachusetts, I forget, one of you may know the new law that was passed. There's a law that was just passed in Massachusetts where you can't discriminate on students' hair. And so when we think about it, tone, dress code, cultural differences all become weapons to force students of color, disabled, poor, and queer students out of the school and into the school to prison nexus. If now we are saying that there has to be a law to not discriminate against kids' hair, that is particularly for Black and brown children, oftentimes for Black and brown women. And so what we're trying to do with restorative justice is say, look at these policies. Are they fair? And where are they coming from? And what are we telling students they have to be in order for them to be great students? Whose norms and values are we practicing and protecting? When I got to Esperanza, there was this thing. They would say that the cafeteria was too loud. And so they had to go in. And when I started, I think there were folks who expected me to be disciplinarian. And folks who know that's not who I am. And the cafeteria was too loud, and the kids needed to be quiet. And kids would get reprimanded if they were too loud. And I remember walking in and thinking to myself, the first time I walked into the cafeteria and heard all the noise, I mean, first of all, it's a middle school. If you ever walk into a middle school and the cafeteria is quiet, there's a problem. Second of all, I have 52 cousins in Lawrence. I have one aunt who hosts Sunday dinners. If you think you can get a conversation across the table at that Sunday dinner, good luck. It is a cultural norm of ours. Many times Dominicans affirm each other by listening to your story and almost one-upping you. You say I had a flat tire yesterday, I got 2 yesterday. And that is the way that we affirm that we're listening to your story. We're with you in the struggle. We're with you in your pain. And so if that's what the kids are learning at home, and that's who they are, then that's how their interaction is going to be at lunch. So we should expect that the lunchroom is going to be loud, because they're going to be practicing social interactions the way that they learned at home. So that in itself is restorative. Because we're teaching kids, when you come to school, yes, of course, like the way that you are at home is beautiful and perfect. And that's how it should be in school. And I never forget that. It was just like the most absurd thing to me. It's like they have to be loud. They will transition to the classroom differently. If you try to repress all that, and then have them step into the classroom, and then think all of a sudden everybody's going to be quiet and paying attention in the classroom, it's a mistake. That's an example of like the cultural norms that we're thinking about when we enforce them in our schools or place them in our schools. Where are they coming from? That's the question we need to ask. And that's true in organizations as well. I would say that the US Department of Education, they released data a couple of years ago around the treatment of Black and brown girls in schools. And so just quickly, the Black and brown girls and other girls of color experience disciplinary policies and disproportionately high suspension and expulsion rates compared to their peers. They are 3 times more likely to be referred to law enforcement, 4 times more likely to be arrested, 3 times more likely to receive corporal punishment, and twice as likely to be physically restrained than white girls. That's from the US Department of Education. And so this work of restorative justice, while it's this like warm, friendly, kind of just beautiful approach, it's also incredibly urgent. And it's late. In our country, this is happening at unfair rates. We see it all the time. I'll give you guys a quick story that will really depict on how it has worked at Esperanza. We had a student who was just kind of like chronically late on Mondays and Tuesdays. And typically, when that child is late, I think that the old system that the school had was if a child was late 3 times, we would call home. It was late 5 times, it was an in-house detention, and so on and so forth. What we did with the child was that we had a circle. And we told the child, please invite a trusted friend and a trusted adult. And we had the restorative justice coordinator. The child, we didn't say to the child, you're in trouble for this and all these other things. They had a circle practice and they had a prompt. And the prompt was, what are your mornings like? And everybody went. The teacher went first and said, I hate mornings. I'm not a morning person. I need like 3 cups of coffee and gave her a story about her mornings. We got around to that one student. She said, my mornings are usually fine, but early in the week is really hard because mom works the night shift. And so we're like super late in the morning and I just said brushing. Okay, so there's a data point. So the circle ended. And the restorative justice coordinator went to the principal and said, I know why X student is late Mondays and Tuesdays. Mom's working the night shift. So we reached out to a family that lives near that student and said, can you pick up this child on Mondays and Tuesdays and bring him to school? And they were like, of course, we love that kid. So they came. So now the child comes to school on time, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. The child doesn't have to feel like they're a bad student. It's not stepping into school Mondays and Tuesdays full of stress and guilt. And mom doesn't have to feel guilty for having worked the night shift. All because we asked the question, what are your mornings like? As opposed to putting in a deterrent saying, if you are late, X happens. Therefore, like that is not taken into consideration, like all the complexities of the child's home. It's unfair. And simply by asking that question and having that circle practice, we're able to get a place of unpacking the truth behind the behavior and addressing it. And that has a fundamentally different trajectory for that child because of it. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I have a bunch of other examples. Let me see. I'll end quickly with just the core assumptions of restorative justice as kind of the ethos of our school. That is that everyone has a true core self that is good, wise, and powerful. We are profoundly interconnected. We all have a deep desire to be in right relationship. We all have gifts, and we are all needed for what we bring. We are holistic beings who need to take care of our bodies, hearts, spirits, and minds in order to learn and grow. We need habits and practice to help us live from our core selves. Our teachers and our students know that those are our fundamental beliefs around restorative justice at Esperanza. And so, yeah, thank you for your time on this. I could talk about restorative justice and the work at Esperanza forever, but I will hand it over.
Thank you, Jadi. What an honor to share the stage with both of you gentlemen. This is great. Before I met Jadi recently, I kept hearing about him, about all the great work that he was doing at Esperanza. And we met recently at a men's circle in the community, which I helped co-facilitate. And that's just the type of guy he is. He is. I see him as somebody who is very successful, high-functioning, individual who serves this community at a high capacity. And here he is in a men's circle with men who represent, all kinds of backgrounds, people who are just recently incarcerated, people who are just out of college, people like me who are in the community as educators. And it was such an honor to see you at that circle. So thank you for being there. Yeah. All right. So I just want to start off with one question, and that is, I'm going to invite everyone here to think, what is the most harmful thing you have ever done towards another person? So what is the most harmful thing you have ever done towards someone else? Could be anybody, a sibling, a friend, a neighbor, a stranger, a child, a son or daughter. And then when that memory comes up, try to imagine how it would feel to be forever judged by your community, by your family, by your loved ones for that act that you committed towards that person. Now, would you agree that the feeling that comes up when you think about this topic or that question, raise your hand if you feel like the feeling that comes up, if that is a common human experience, raise your hand if you feel like that's a common human response to that question. Can anyone just by volunteer in a response? What is it that you felt? If you can name an emotion. Go right ahead.
You feel guilt.
Right.
You feel sadness, you feel guilt, you feel insecure.
Right. Raise your hand if you felt something similar. Okay, so the Mayans have a phrase, I'm sure some folks are familiar with it. In Lakesh means I am another you. And for me, I think restorative justice is a beautiful framework that allows us to teach this truth, that we are all in this together. And I hope that that example was able to demonstrate how we do, no matter who we are, there's a common human experience, and we are all members of one human family who experience a wide range of different things that cause suffering, but we all suffer, right? And we all cause suffering. So I think it's natural for us to think of what we can do in our schools and our institutions to create frameworks that help people through these things. And I think restorative justice, restorative practices is a perfect framework for that. So my journey towards restorative justice is interesting. I actually, when I attended Lawrence Public Schools, this was a zero tolerance school district. At least in my experience, that's what it was. I was just like Dr. Fish. I was not the ideal student. Middle school, I was removed from the traditional program and placed in an alternative school, which actually was in this location before they built the new Lawrence High School. That was the alternative school that back then. I was there for a couple months, and then sophomore year at Lawrence High School, I was removed from the traditional program again and placed in the night school program. And I'm the youngest of 8 children. Both my parents had previous marriages where they had children. So I have 5, there's 5 boys, and I'm the youngest of everyone. And by the time I was in high school, when I was at Lawrence High, at the old high school on the north side, I was the only boy out of the 5 of us who still didn't have a criminal record to speak of. And my sisters were dealing with issues, challenges of their own. They had all been asked to leave the house when they became pregnant at an early age. Not sure where that practice came from, but I think it's common in a lot of immigrant families that come from the Caribbean. So I didn't have a lot of role models to speak of growing up. So I was on that same path, and talking about school to prison pipeline, my brothers. In the night school program, I was given a second chance. And I was allowed to come back into the day school, and that changed everything. So from the beginning, I really do believe in second chances. And I think restorative justice provides us with an ability to make more space for second chances. I actually think we should have third chances, fourth, fifth, as many as it takes, really. It's hard to talk about because, as you can imagine. So, one of the things I think about as an educator is how do we improve our schools? What is it that we can do to make our schools better? I feel like as an academic, I look at different reforms that have taken place in the recent years, and it seems like no matter what we try, we can't figure out how to improve school systems that serve the most vulnerable communities. It's been going on for decades. So for me, I'm just like, maybe we can try something new. restorative justice is a new paradigm, and it's worked. There's so much evidence that it works for schools and communities internationally, really. So why not try it, right? So my journey to restorative justice, it was very interesting one. But there are some frameworks that I go to. Mindfulness is a really important practice in my life. I think that, for one, restorative justice or restorative practices allows us to. It's an entry point. I call it an entry point for many different frameworks that allows us to consider new ways to educate and to serve our youth. So mindfulness. There's one text that I wanted to recommend. There is no mud, no lotus. That's Thich Nhat Hanh. Which talks about the messiness of this work, and how when I think of the work we do in restorative circles, just like Jadi had mentioned, it's not always a kumbaya situation. We have to face really important topics when we enter in our circles, and so when we train people for this work, it's really important to acknowledge that it's not easy. It's not easy work. I also like to recommend another text called The Four Pivots by Sean Ginwright, which is a text that talks a lot about the need to serve as each other's mirrors. Going back to that phrase of In Lakesh, one of the best ways to grow, one of the best ways to heal, I found, is to work communally with other people and be honest with each other. I can be a mirror for you only if I'm honest with myself and you. And so that requires a lot of vulnerability. It requires a lot of authenticity. And I think circles create a space where we can learn the skills needed to do that work. Moving on, we have just going back to the philosophy of restorative justice. I know that Jadi already mentioned its indigenous way of knowing. When I hear that, I like to also emphasize that everyone has indigenous roots, everyone. And so it's, I feel like sometimes when we say indigenous, it's almost like a separation, like those folks, and that's them, and this is us. We're actually, I know some European friends who have traced their I guess their ancestry to these, whether it's Viking or Germanic tribes, or there's a lot of history there. And I think that as long as you can remember that we all, at one point, all people used to be more connected to nature, more connected to each other communally. And I think that's where this comes from as well. It's about remembering. So yes, restorative justice, for restorative practices, we have to learn a lot, but part of that learning process is, Jadi mentioned, remembering who we are as a people. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be connected? What are the implications of knowing that our survival depends on interconnectedness, right? So one of the things I like most about it is its emphasis on mutual concern, human dignity, worth, forgiveness, non-judgment. These are things that are extremely difficult sometimes. Can you imagine how difficult it is to forgive someone who has harmed you? These are things that we learn how to do in our restorative circles, right? So that non-judgment piece, for me, that's something that I still struggle with on a daily basis. Working in a school, when a kid, says something very rude or disrespectful, it's very difficult not to judge that young person. It's very difficult not to start, get that whole thought process going on, like, geez, where did this kid get raised, all that stuff, right? I think restorative work teaches us how to do that important inner work that, it helps us become aware that if we judge our students, that judgment can get in the way of how well we're able to serve them. Relational healing is a big theme, empathy, compassion. One big distinction I like to make when I do this work with folks is restorative justice versus restorative practices. Restorative justice is more of a, coming out of the court system. I think there's a lot more history of restorative work happening in the courts. But one awareness is if something's being dealt with in the court, that means that the harm has already been committed. So that's restorative justice is a response, whereas restorative practice is more of the proactive work that we do. So in schools, when we talk about schools, we want to focus more on restorative practices because that's the preventative side. And there's a rule, there's like an 80-20 rule where we want to focus 80% of our energy and our resources in the proactive side. And the more we're able to do that, the less we have to do in the responsive side. So then we can put 20% or less into reacting or responding to harm that is caused. Just in case, that was a big one. When I first got into this field, I was always wondering what's the difference between restorative justice and restorative practices. So significance of this work in our schools, we talk about, contextually, a community like Lawrence, there's a lot of, we look at the geopolitical nuances of our parents, our grandparents, where they came from. There's legacies in our community of colonialism, patriarchy, racism, colorism. So you have to think about, what's going to show up in our schools from all of that, So I think we need to constantly be thinking about frameworks that we can apply that will empower us to respond to these kinds of traumas that our students are inheriting and carrying into our schools, right? That's obviously going to cause some difficulty. Poverty is a big one, right? Racial oppression. So one thing that I also think of is, when I think there's this belief that we can teach about, for example, civics, in civics class or in social studies class, we can teach about conflict resolution, or we can teach about peace work, or we can teach about, truth and reconciliation, how to resolve conflicts. We can, and that is part of history class, but if the environment in the history class isn't embodying the values of truth and reconciliation, then how can we authentically be teaching it? That's my question. So again, if we're looking for reasons to integrate restorative work into the instructional piece, there it is. It's not just teaching the values, it's embodying the values, right? So it just, the other obvious ones is it's going to help us build community in our school, which is essential. Restorative practices can be culturally responsive. It can be community responsive. It can be trauma informed. It can help teach racial consciousness. So when we talk about teaching youth or teaching adults about implicit bias, if anyone's ever been to a workshop on, DEI or diversity sensitivity training, a lot of that stuff takes place in a dialogue, right? We're reflecting, we're talking about, we're interrogating our own biases, right? We're having honest and courageous conversations. Guess what? A circle provides the platform for that. So there's just so many different benefits, I think, to having this framework in our schools. And I'm really grateful. I consider myself very, very lucky to be able to have leadership in the district and on the campus that value restorative justice to the point where, the creation of my position is an investment by the school district in restorative work for our children, and for that I'm super grateful. There's this Japanese concept called kintsugi, where they take, if a bowl shatters, like a glass bowl shatters, they'll repair it with gold. They'll put the pieces back together with gold, and then it becomes this beautiful ornament. I have a picture, I wish the screen was up, but that's a really good concept to think of when we're thinking about restorative values, restorative justice. because it shows that the outcome, so something can break, something can shatter, harm can be done, right? But sometimes, if the process is done, the healing and repair process is done appropriately enough, what comes out of that could be even more beautiful than what it was before. Just like the kintsugi, I'm still learning the word. So that's one thing I like to tell people to think about. It's like when somebody causes harm, somebody breaks a rule, somebody does something that is, we want to judge them for, rather than just looking at what they did. First of all, look at the cause of the behavior, which Jadi mentioned, but also look at what's possible beyond the behavior. What's possible after doing the repair work. One of the things we're seeing with our kids right now is a lot of students are coming forward proactively after we've engaged and done restorative work with them, and they are, same kids who we labeled or who were labeled by others as problem kids. These kids like to fight. They're the ones coming up to us now and making us aware of things that are bubbling up between other students. So it's incredible, some of the impacts we're having. So specifically, some of the shifts we're seeing at Lawrence High School campus. So it's a restorative shift. It's a mindset, right? So usually I think schools look at, when it comes to discipline, the kids need to stop breaking the rules. So we're trying to shift from that to, it's not about breaking the rules, it's about causing harm. It's about, when we're having conversations with students around, misaligned behaviors, it's not that you broke the rule, it's that we want you to see how your behavior, your actions are causing harm to this community. And that has actually been very successful. So another shift is, it's not about behavior management, it's about relationships. Another shift is, it's less about individualism and more about community. I know that, especially in the United States, there's a culture of rugged individualism, and that we take pride in, I think, sometimes, and I feel like that can be very harmful. I know a lot of men, in the men's work that I do, who have been convinced that they need to suffer alone because, I'm strong, I'm an individual, that whole idea. So we have a huge emphasis on pre-conferencing at Lawrence High School, meaning that before we do any kind of mediation process, we're checking in multiple times with students who are involved. That is a big shift, making sure that there's student buy-in, making sure that there's student choice, making sure that the families are involved, huge emphasis on family partnerships, which has always been, I think, emphasized at Lawrence High School, but it's also part of the work that we've done in the restorative realm. We have a restorative reflection room on campus where students who need to, be supported in some way, they're not able to sit in class and learn for whatever reason. We have a space where we have people trained in this space who can sit with those students and help them reset, help them reflect on how they can be more successful, and then they can return to class. And nobody has to be suspended, nobody has to be given in-house, that kind of thing. We have a student wellness center that's coming together where we're going to be doing a lot of mindfulness work with students. We have about 14 culture specialists across campus who have been trained to do restorative work with students, direct student support. So when I say there's people who are trained to support students within the reflection room, we're talking about these culture specialists, and it's beautiful. Earlier we were having a conversation about diversity in the school system and in all systems really, and the culture team especially is pretty phenomenal. I think, out of the entire team, there's 14, I think, and out of the 14, I think 12 are bilingual. They're all people of color. Most of them are from the community. It's a beautiful thing to see. So we're doing that work as well. The representation piece is essential. And so, especially with parents, when parents come in, they have people that they can talk to and connect with. We have teacher, what we're calling SEL teacher leads, teachers who are being hired to do some extra work around making sure that this restorative and social emotional learning piece is being expanded across the campus in their specific programs in various ways. And we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like later. We're doing a lot of teacher training and coaching. I have office hours where teachers can come to my office and seek coaching or advice on how they can do this work with their students. And lastly, I'll just talk about some outcomes. The power of restorative responses to behavior. So I'm thinking of a student right now who, again, one of these students who was labeled, was in several fights last year. By the end of the year, we had done so much work with this student. She was still, making some poor decisions. So I actually found her tearing down a sign in the hallway. And because we have cameras on the school, we could see who's doing it. So I went in and I found out it was her. So I had I think in the past, a response would be, that's destruction of school property, that's vandalism, this is a D code violation, you're suspended. Instead, I sat down with her and I had that conversation. How is this harming the community? And she changed pretty significantly. So within the next week or so, she had started coming to my office to say hi in between classes, talking with the other culture specialists. And now this student has gone from being somebody who was viewed as against us to now she's part of the team. So that's the power of restorative work that we do. We also are doing a lot of reentry meetings and just a lot of, student-adult collaboration has increased significantly since we've been doing this work. Students are coming to us. They're coming forward when there's problems happening, whether it's gang related, whether it's something happened on social media, there's something about to happen. Students are coming forward and they're sharing that information with us before like the fight happens, and it's incredible to be able to have these partnerships with students. So last thing I'll say is. When I started by asking, one of the questions I asked was, how do we fix our school systems? Restorative justice is not the end-all be-all answer to reforming our schools, but I do think it's a powerful entry point, and this is why. I think that school systems require a lot of work, a lot more focus. We have a long way to go in terms of resolving the issues that are getting in the way when we're trying to serve our most vulnerable communities. And given that there's so much work ahead of us, we need to have frameworks that will allow us that will empower us to resolve conflicts. That we need to have frameworks that will empower us to keep things from falling apart as they so often do. And I think restorative justice, is a powerful entry point for us to be able to do more work. Thank you.
Thank you, young Dr. Quinn. Appreciate it. Good. All right, we're going to get into a Q&A session here. And as moderator, I will take liberty of asking a question or two first. Quinn, thank you for that beautiful metaphor. I won't try to pronounce the Japanese word, but I know what you're talking about. Yanni and I were like, yeah, we've seen those, and they're beautiful. It seems to me, earlier when you were talking, you mentioned a number of things that come out of the restorative justice process. You mentioned empathy and compassion, and one word that you didn't mention, which I wonder if this is the gold that gets laid between the cracks, is the word trust. And I wonder if you could comment on your experience with, the change in trust. I think that the anecdote that you had at the end about changing that girl speaks to that a bit, that there were people coming to you ahead of time with, rumbles that are ready to happen. They have to trust you, don't they?
So yeah, I just would trust the fact that I should have added that. Thank you, I will. Yeah, I think trust is a huge component. It's a huge essential word. Lack of trust is what causes many of our problems that we have in our community, in our schools, among colleagues, among, I feel like that's it, and I think that one of the things that we're able to do is work on that. So this is a concept that I've actually looked into is trust. Where does it come from? Why is it lack of trust so rampant in our communities? And I think the simple answer is trauma. So Rhonda McGee wrote a book called The Inner Work of Racial Healing. And she talks about how trauma lies to us. It teaches us lies about each other. So when people experience harm, because of trauma, they learn to not trust. And I think that within these circles, we're doing that work of rebuilding that trust. Trust requires community, and so community is what we're developing.
Thank you for that. Yeah, you're not getting out of this without a question or two, and then I'll open it up to the floor. Let me just ask you, it's a great story, and then your girls go off, and I think there's a little bit of an echo of my answer in the fact that you have a 100% high school graduation rate when your girls stop at 8th grade, and then you have high 70% college graduation rate. So I think that might be an echo of the answer that I'm looking for to the question. What evidence have you seen of there being latency, a continuation of the beneficial effects of being in community that respects each other and finds ways to be in community in hopeful, healing ways as opposed to punitive ways?
I appreciate the framing of that question. I think for us, while we have that high school graduation rate and the college one, restorative practice has really been taking place for about 3 years at Esperanza. And so we're seeing with the students that are sophomores and juniors in high school, where you can see how it translates to those years. It's less about, I think, let me say that I think the priority is that it's a strong sense of self, right? And I think, the Boston Globe once did that article on the number of valedictorians from Boston Public Schools that drop out of college. Has nothing to do with academic ability and has everything to do with sense of self and belonging and whatnot. And so what we always say is that we don't want our students to check their culture at the door, and we want to graduate kids who are comfortable in their own skin. And so when we see kids who are coming back, who can go to some of these communities in which they're the only kid of color in their English class, and they have a strong sense of who they are, and they know that back at Esperanza at least, there are some people who love them and they can trust, right? Because the challenge of the work is it's creating the world you wish to see while preparing the students for the world they're going to inherit. Because just that we're doing that at Esperanza doesn't mean that when they go to whatever boarding school in rural Maine, that's going to be the cultural norm. So how do our kids live with both those things at the same time? And I think for the students that we're seeing now, it's when they come back and they want to work with students and they have this strong sense of self and love of community and love of Lawrence, and that those things are they're anchoring them throughout their experiences.
Thank you very much. Do we have a microphone on the floor there, Steve? Just this one? Oh, no. Good. Okay. So I think we have a couple of questions. I saw Dr. Haddad's hand first, so we'll go there and then we'll come over to the left here.
Hello, everybody. I'm Eduardo Haddad. I'm a physician, Lawrence General. And first of all, I wanted to thank you, the two speakers, Jadi and Quin, for putting your hearts out there and communicating so much of what you have, which is empathy and the need to help the ones that are not so endowed. And I can sense that, and this is what we all want to do. But from a more realistic point of view, I have to ask the question. You touched on the point just now where yes, at the same time that we want to validate their cultural upbringing, the value of their own roots, ultimately you do want to prepare them for the world that we live in, which is not always friendly, and it has its own set of rules, it has its own set of expectations that are frequently in conflict with a lot of what we were talking about. So to me, it's great that we bring them to be self-worth, that you validate their feelings, that you acquire their trust. But ultimately, you need to add something else to this, which is the ability to adapt to a reality that it's not necessarily their reality, you know, the way they were brought up, where you want to be loud, it's great, it's an expression of affection. I understand that. I'm from Brazil, you know, I grew up the same way. Well, when you come to America and you need to work in a different environment, you have to be sensitive to that. Some people will not take that well. Some people will misunderstand it. And I think we as teachers and as people that have experienced this have an obligation in a way to prepare, you know, the young folks for that reality. Because this is what's going to get them to bump against people and they're going to be mad at them. So I wonder, how do you do this and how do you balance all of this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There are a couple ways that I think about that. You know, I think some of the work of restorative justice is not just to think about creating almost like an alternate reality for the kids. It's essentially to help students be their most authentic selves so that they can succeed. And so it's about, you know, what we were talking about, without applying consequences and discipline, without understanding who the kid is and who their history is, what their history is, so that they're in the best trajectory. I also think that we're teaching students to understand what it means to be in community, so that they understand what are the implications of causing harm in community, but also like what does it mean to be loved and trusted, so that they're not in toxic relationships. You know, with teachers, they can be in a relationship with a teacher. If they step into a classroom, this is not the way that a relationship is supposed to be in a classroom. And they can challenge that. And I think that's okay to challenge that piece and understand like what their self-worth is. I think it's really important that students understand their self-worth, and that them assimilating into a culture, whether it's like a microculture of a school or larger culture, should not come at the cost of their own sense of self. Because I think that is really harmful. I think when assimilation happens in a way in which students say, all right, in order for me to succeed at this place, I need to act this way. At some point, that child is going to want to get back to themselves, their natural selves. And it may be when they're 20, 30, 40, or 50 years old. But at some point, you're going to want to get back to who you are. And so if students are walking into environments understanding this culture is going to be different than Esperanza, but I have a really clear sense of who I am and that my story is really important. And I know that I need to navigate this particular place with a particular different skill set. That's part of the goal, and I think that's part of what immigrant families do really well. There's something at the school that we call, that's part of the love of community. It comes from a framework of a professor called Taveras, who talks about cultural capitals. And what she says is that immigrants have this thing called navigational capital. They have the ability to navigate different cultures with grace and ease in a way that other folks don't, because they've been doing it for so long. And so that's a great example of the value that we try to name to our students early on and say, you already can do this. You know how to navigate different cultures really well because your parents have been doing it and you have been doing it. Now, let's find out how you do it without losing a sense of who you are. Without feeling like, in order for you to feel like you belong at Philip Sandover, it means that you really have to never talk about being from rural Dominican Republic. That both those things can exist. And so and it doesn't always happen, right? Like that's the goal, that's the ideal. And there's a lot in between that. Sometimes it doesn't work out and sometimes it does, but I think that's what we're striving for, is carrying two realities at the same time.
Just a quick tidbit. So there's that phrase that I'm sure a lot of folks are are familiar with hurt people. There's one that's a little bit less familiar, and that's healed people heal people. So what I envision is a world where more schools are doing this work, and when our youth, go out into the world and encounter challenging situations, challenging people, they have a skill set that they've developed, and they have the capacity and the emotional intelligence to navigate that situation in a way that might even help the person who is challenging them. And I think that's a beautiful possibility with this work.
We'll have time for one more question after this.
Thank you both. I'm Steve Fink. We have a business here in town, active volunteer in the community, and I've been in both of your schools. And the feeling at Esperanza Academy has always struck me as something that would last. And just one other quick comment. Boy, is there a connection between your last session on healthcare, this session, and your next session on drugs. Somehow this all has to get tied together. Okay, so I too have my story. I'm not going to study my story like Dr. Fish did, but a man saved my life. He came in and grabbed the hold of me. He's 90. We're still friends. Still friends 40 years later. So my question to you is, you're talking, I like your idea of the circle, but there's also, he gave me a job, and that's what made the difference. He grabbed the hold of me and got me a job. There's got to be that sense of that person who interacts and builds. You talked about relationships and trust. That trust word was such a big word, and empathy. How do we rig this so that the community is here, not just the school, not to diminish the school, but we need people. This guy was from outside the school. How do we get people like that involved so that we're all part of this, and the students who are going through it realize we're all part of this hope?
If I could figure that out, I'd probably be on tour right now talking about. But just to reference what Quin had mentioned earlier, I think it's folks doing the work. The work that Quin is doing with the men's group, that's a mental health men's group that when I did the circle, it's folks from all walks of life. And I mean all walks of life. And so many guys, it was their first time being vulnerable to a group of men. And so it takes folks like Quin who are going to have the courage to be vulnerable and to lead these circles and to get folks together, whether it's 2 or 3 people. Now I don't even know how many people. And then it's just, as Quin said, heal people. And hopefully there are folks within their circle that are doing that with their families. And I think that's the only way to do the work, at least in my mind. It's sort of one group of people at a time.
Yeah, I think we can also talk to our elected officials about funding and programming that can be initiated. I think we can definitely do more around the restorative side. I know that within the criminal justice system, there is a lot more investment into restorative approaches. But again, that's after something has already happened. So I think if we were more intentional about doing it in the community, the restorative practice side of the spectrum, I think there's lots of possibilities. Like, why not have some kind of initiative where there's an office or a grant that pays a nonprofit to hire a team of restorative practitioners to do community work, to do street work, something like that.
Yeah, I think about, you remember when I think COVID was hitting, there's a mental health crisis, and there was an organization that was funding barbers and being like mental health counselors and specialists. And I thought, I always thought that was such a brilliant idea. Men were going into barbershops to get haircuts, and the barbers that were giving haircuts were actually being trained to be able to support them because they share so much with their barbers. So there's these innovative ideas that folks can come up with to address these issues as well.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. I think that's Martha in the back. And then we'll close the remarks.
It's still good afternoon. No, good evening. Quin, Jadi, thank you so much for loving our community, number one, because I know you both have a passion for the city. I love the word that you use, restorative practice. I think that we all need to put that into practice in our work that we do with community. I think that one of the words that, like Dr. Fish said, trust, but I also think that what I heard from when you were both speaking was the fact that you take children and you teach them to communicate. So I think when you get taught to communicate, which is the most powerful thing that we all have as adults, right? The ability to be able to speak what you're feeling and to make yourself understood. And in our cultures, most of the time we were taught, siéntate y cállate, or don't say how you feel, because, I know I got in a lot of trouble with my father because my father's, Rhoda, ya, por favor, stop, because I wanted to express what I felt. So, I commend you for doing that. What I would like to know is, I see that you're doing this work, both the practice and the justice, but I think that we need to start thinking of bringing this down to the lower level kids, the younger age kids, because I think the younger you teach, the less you're going to have the problems at Lawrence High School. I went to Lawrence High, graduated in '82 from Lawrence High, and we still had fights. I mean, the fights that happen now is no surprise to people that went to school. But I think that we need to do that, and I just wonder what your thoughts are, because I really do feel that this is something that should be taught at an earlier age. And how do we get circles, and not just circles for students, but circles for teachers that, and I know that I had some, that would just think it's Lawrence, they don't want to learn, number one. And then the other one is, my parents brought me here from Cuba in 1969. I stayed back in second grade because there was no bilingual education, so I couldn't master the English language. And Mrs. Paul, my fourth grade teacher, took me under her wing, and she actually lived on my street until she died. And I used to shovel her sidewalk and go to the store for her, because she took me under her wing and I paid it forward. So thank you.
So the question about like the lower grades, anybody who's part of Esperanza knows this. I did not put her here to ask me this question. Yeah, we are in the process of moving the school to a new building in Lawrence and expanding to the lower grades to be a pre-K to 8 school. Dr. Fish and I met for the first time last year in December, last school year, and one of the dreams has always been, and I was sharing with him, I said, if somebody was to give me a blank check, we would have the first prenatal to 8th grade tuition-free school ever, all girls school. Because if we know that trauma can be intergenerational and it can be passed down, I think the work needs to start when children are in the womb. And if we can start with restorative work and even music therapy, we know, for example, with music therapy, like we know that the prefrontal cortex, where executive functioning and all that stuff lives with children, is underdeveloped with kids who have high stress and traumatic upbringings. We also know that music therapy is a direct way to address that neurological deficit. And so if we can start when children are 1, 2, 3, however young, we know that we're doing the work, as you pointed out, that be less work when they're older. And so that's part of our vision, is to go pre-K to 8. And, the ideal would be to start as early as when children are in the womb, for exactly what you said. And our communities oftentimes don't have that service of, or many communities don't, a restorative justice program that starts when kids are 4 or 5, to understand what it means to be in community in that way. So if there's a donor in this room that wants to have a conversation, please let me know. But I think for us as an independent school, it's different than the public schools. It depends on funding for us to be able to accomplish those things, but we would do it in a heartbeat if we could.
So just going back to honoring indigenous ways of knowing, there's a hymn that the lyrics say, humble yourself to the children, you got to know what they know. And the reason I share that is because in these circles, again, this concept of mirrors, one of the most powerful things that one of the powerful things that the circle does, quoting Kay Krantz, the circle does things. It takes on a life of its own. It's a flow thing. Anyway, we serve as mirrors for each other in the circle when the masks come off. So, you know, we go through life wearing masks, you know, and then when we show up as our authentic selves, we remove the mask. And the circle creates a safe space with psychological safety and all the types of safety that Jadi mentioned earlier. Hopefully, if it's done correctly, where people can remove their masks and there's an authentic connection that is made, and that's how we serve each other in that way. So even if it doesn't matter what age group, there's always something that can be offered to us and that we can offer others in that space of authenticity. And so the question about children, there are things that they can teach us in these spaces.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Round of applause, please, for everybody. I want to thank our speakers, Jadi, Quinn. Thank you so much for bringing your whole selves here and being authentic with us about this. In front of you, you have a couple of gifts for your participation with us today. Thank you so much. I want to take a moment also to recognize the staff of External Affairs at Greater Lawrence Family Health Center. Julie, who's walking around with the camera there. Mark, who saved our bacon with the audio. Mary Lyman, the organizer of organizers. Laura, thank you so much. David and Steve as well. Our next event is in your program, TBD, in terms of the actual date. We believe it'll be in September, maybe October, but we will let you know. It will be on substance use and the hope of recovery. And please, if you like this program, if you're here at the last program as well, tell 2 other organizations to each send 2 people, and we'll have a big kickoff of a very fulsome crowd for this once the summer vacations are over. Thank you so much for teaching us about restorative practice. And to everyone, have a great night. Thank you so much for being here.